Hey AP Bio, it's me, Miss Willis, and I'm here to talk to you about the evidence for evolution. There are four main pieces of evidence we're going to go through here in this mini PowerPoint to show you that yes, things indeed have changed over time. So let's go ahead and get started. The first piece of evidence that we're going to talk about is the finding of different types of fossils. What is a fossil? Well, a fossil can be any preserved remain or impression of a life form. It can be something that existed in the past, or it could be current and present. Some very common examples of fossils that are found are things like bones of organisms and shells of creatures, and even leaf imprints can be considered fossils. Now, what do fossils show us when it comes to evolution? Well, evolution is the change of a species through time, right? The change of the allele frequency of a gene pool through time. Well, it definitely shows us that some animals or plants, just organisms in general, aren't here anymore. They are extinct. So organisms did exist in the past, for example, like the Tyrannosaurus Rex, T-Rex, and they don't exist anymore. And number two, it also shows us that organisms have changed through time. So you can find fossils of, for example, older horse species, and they resemble modern day horse species, but there's definitely some modifications or changes that have happened with their maybe bone structure or teeth structure. So fossils are really important when you're trying to show that things have changed through time. Now here is one fossil that is thought to be the oldest hominid or human fossil that exists today. Its name is Ardi, short for Ardipithecus ramidus, and through carbon dating, we have been able to determine that this species existed about 4.4 million years ago. I know you've probably heard of Lucy. Lucy is also a hominid fossil that's thought to be about 3.2 million years ago, and this is a Australopithecus afarensis species. It was found in Africa and was thought to be the oldest hominid fossil until Ardi was found, which predated it. Now, fossils are preserved life forms, right? They are either bones or leaves or some sort of living structure that existed in the past. I love this map here because it does show the idea of Pangea and how all the continents were connected at one point, and the way that also ties into evolution is you can find similar fossils on different continents, and then of course the continents spread out. So you can see there's like fossil remains of a freshwater reptile called Mesosaurus, and it's found on the southern tip of South America, those fossils, as well as the southern tip of Africa. And you can find those fossils throughout the world. A lot of times I get asked, how do we know that something is 4.4 million years old, right? Well, scientists use a tool called radioactive dating. Most commonly in living life forms, it's carbon dating, because fossils do contain radioactive materials such as carbon-14, and they decay at very consistent rates. So if we can figure out how much carbon-14 is left in a fossil, then we can determine approximately how old it was based upon when it existed. A second piece of evidence that is used is the idea of morphologies. So looking at bone form and bone structure and comparing them amongst other species. One way that morphologies can be used is through homologous structures, or looking at these structures that exist amongst different organisms. So right now you are looking at homologous structures of a human, a seal, and a whale. And if you look at these structures, you'll notice they all pretty much have the same number of carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. The idea behind this is if they are all the same, then they probably do have some sort of common ancestry. So they were once related and then broke off into different species. Keep in mind these homologous structures, they can be internal or external, so sometimes you can't necessarily see them just by looking at an organism, and they may not have the same function now. So like our human hands definitely don't have the same function as a flipper of a whale. Do not confuse homologous structures to analogous structures. Homologous structures are those that have the similar structure but may not have the same function just due to the evolution of the species. Analogous structures, although you look at them and you may think that they are structurally similar because they look similar on the outside, they aren't necessarily the case on the inside. So we call those analogous structures. So for example, a bat wing and a butterfly wing and a bird wing, they all have the same function, mainly to get the organism to fly. But if upon further inspection, you will notice that they don't have similar bone structure within them internally. And thus, these organisms do not have common ancestry. So we call them analogous structures. Vestigial structures can also be used when looking at different structures and forms in organisms. A vestigial structure is a remnant of a functional structure, and they are used for comparison for evolutionary purposes, meaning if you see one organism has this structure and then you compare it to another species who has the same structure, you can infer that maybe at one time they did have a common ancestor and then broke off over time. A really cool vestigial structure that exists in whales is the presence of pelvic bones. So whales are mammals, right? But they live in the water. So the idea is that whales came from an ancestral wolf-type species, and obviously they migrated into the water, but they still have remnants of those back hind legs and of course the pelvis. So if you look at a structure of a fossil structure of a whale, you'll see that they do have those pelvic bones. And so if you've ever been to an aquarium that has like a whale skeleton on display, you will notice that hanging near the backside of the whale will be those pelvic bones, and they kind of just hang in space. And those are the vestigial structures of a pelvic bone with obviously hind legs that existed in previous wolf-like structures. And you'll find this common to many of the mammals that exist today. They have these pelvic-like bones that exist in the same area. Another way that morphologies can be used is looking at embryo structure and embryo development. And taking a look at these embryos, you can see, even though it's fish, a reptile, bird, and human, they do have gill slits present in their embryo state. Embryology is the study of embryos and their development, and you can use comparative anatomy to infer evolutionary relationships because they possess similar body structure and form. So we were just saying that homologous structures definitely show common ancestry. The idea, however, is that there was one common ancestor and then over time the species separated from one another. So speciation occurred to create all the different species that we see today. When you have this, that is called divergent evolution. So you have one species that, of course, gave rise to a number of different species. And this can be inferred upon based on fossil and morphology evidence. There's also something called convergent evolution. So this is the idea that you don't have common ancestry. So the species are different in their own right. And over time, they have developed to look like one another because they live in similar environments. So if you take a look at this example here, you have a fish and a shark or a dolphin and a penguin. Yeah, they do have very similar body shapes, but they don't share common ancestry. They have similar body functions because they live in a similar environment, aka the water. When you have convergent evolution, that gives rise to what we call analogous structures that we just talked about, and in divergent evolution, that gives rise to homologous structures. The third piece of evidence that is used for evolutionary purposes is the idea of biochemicals. So let's go ahead and talk about what that means. Have you ever stopped to think about just the different life forms that exist and what's common between all of us? Well, if you have, then you've noticed that every single life form here on Earth contains some sort of genetic material. Whether that genetic material be DNA or RNA, it really doesn't matter because it is genetic code. And that's shared by all life forms. So that does support the idea that there was once a common ancestor and then things broke off over time. Also notice that that genetic material is pretty much made up of the same nitrogen bases. So if it's DNA, we're talking about adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. And if it's RNA, of course, substitute the uracil for thymine. It also is made of sugar and phosphate. And so all of those biochemicals are consistent throughout all life forms here on Earth. Lastly, the processes that pretty much run metabolism for life, photosynthesis and respiration, they are performed by pretty much every single living organism in some shape or form. So of course, photosynthesis is reserved to the primary producers, but respiration is found throughout. And if you're talking about eukaryotic cells specifically, there are some things that are found in every single eukaryotic cell. So things like the cytoskeleton exists. They have membrane-bound organelles, like we just talked about, the mitochondria and the chloroplast. They have linear chromosomes. So it doesn't matter which eukaryotic cell you're talking about, they all have the same style of chromosome. And lastly, they have endomembrane systems, like the nuclear envelope, that separates those organelles from the rest of the cell. So it's really amazing to stop and think that all of these structures are shared by all eukaryotic cells. And the last piece of evidence that is used to support evolution is genetics. So looking at specific genetic code, whether that be DNA or amino acid sequence, either can tell you about genetic relationships of the organisms. The way that evolutionary biologists use genetics is by looking at the sequence of DNA nucleotides or the amino acid sequences of a protein. So they will actually look at, okay, where are the A's, where are the T's, C's, or G's, or they will look at things like serine and isoleucine, all these other different amino acids and their sequences to infer if there are evolutionary relationships. One of the common ones that is used is cytochrome C. It's a protein that is found in the mitochondria, and it is often used in mammals to infer relationships. So what does that sequencing tell you? Well, if you look at one species DNA and you compare it to another species DNA, and there aren't a lot of differences, you can infer that at one time those organisms probably did share a common ancestor, but then broke up through time. If you compare sequences and you find there are a lot of differences, that usually tells you that, yeah, maybe they did have a common ancestor, but it was a long time ago, and these organisms aren't so related anymore. So it does show evolutionary relationships based on the differences that are in those sequences. Now, with all of this evidence, so with fossils and morphologies and biochemicals and genetics, you can create these guys. These are called phylogenetic trees or also cladograms. And what these diagrams show you is evolutionary relationships between species that exist. They can be extinct species or present species, but the idea is that there was a common ancestor and then of course they branched out through time. We will talk more about phylogeny and cladograms later. So thank you all for hanging in there and paying attention. Bye, everyone.